You're listening to the Westminster Canterbury Tales podcast, creating community to foster joy and well-being. Thanks for listening. Thank you for listening to Westminster Canterbury Tales. Today we are going to hear from Dorothy Bangert, and she's going to give us the privilege of sharing her life story with us and just telling us about who she is. Dorothy, why don't you take it over?
I will. Thank you very much for doing this. It's such a service. My name is Dorothy Bangert. In genealogy, females, we are a maiden name because that's who we are. I just wanted to make that clear. And I'd like to start, this is for my grandchildren. I want to start out by telling you where the Barcoes came to this country. The first Barcoe was named Thomas Bearcock, and the name was spelled B-A-R-C-O-C-K. The C-K was dropped around the time of the American Revolution because they had trouble spelling it. I heard that. But he was a blacksmith, and he wanted to come to the United States, but he had a wonderful trade, and he could read and write, which was a big deal in those days.
Come to the United States from where?
England.
From England.
And he had the skill, but he didn't have the money to get here. So he became an indentured servant. That meant that he sold his labor to someone for 7 years. And at the end of that time, he was given his freedom and I think a little piece of land. It may be a mule, wasn't very much. But that's how the first Thomas Bearcock came to this country in 1630. He settled in Virginia, and he was indentured to a man named Captain William Crawford. And Captain Crawford would later, after his indentureship, move to Portsmouth, and he started the Portsmouth shipyard, which I think is a very interesting point. Wow. And so at the end of Thomas Bearcock's in servitude, his son, I guess there were not a lot of people around to married the daughter of a very well-placed planter named Thomas Jennings. And, it was John Jennings. And his daughter, as I said, married Thomas Bearcock. And they started that line. Now, she was the granddaughter of Sir John Jennings in England, which meant that she was in the royal line. That doesn't mean anything unless you're into genealogy. That put my grandfather's line of genealogy in the royal lines, which took us back to Charlemagne, Sir Thomas More, and I'd like to tell my 3 granddaughters who are Catholic. Sir Thomas More was killed by Henry VIII because he would not sanction his marriage to Anne Boleyn and, leave the Catholic Church. And in 1927, Pope Pius canonized him. So he's now known as St. Thomas More, and I want my granddaughters to know that since they're Catholic. And I've carried my genealogy back to the Romans, and that's all I'm going to say about genealogy. I was born on April the 26th, 1932, and I'm about to turn 90. In Brooklyn, New York. The reason I'm born in Brooklyn was my parents were living in Norfolk, and weeks before I was to be born, my father lost his job. That was the heart of the Depression. There was no work here. In fact, Daddy said there wasn't enough coal on the piers to fire up the boilers on the Navy ships. That's how bad things were. So to get work, he went to New York City. He was an automobile mechanic, and he got a job in a Ford garage in Coney Island. And weeks before I was to be born, he sent for my mother. And so instead of being born in Norfolk, Virginia, I was born in Brooklyn, New York. And it's always bothered me. I keep telling people I'm a Yankee by birth, but I'm a rebel at heart. My father was the son of a blacksmith. All the barcodes from 1630 all the way up were blacksmiths and farmers. And I've heard nothing but great things about my grandfather, but he died before I was born. And my mother had a very colorful father. He was, my father's mother was Catherine Downing, and she was, her genealogy, I said it again, goes back to Downing House of Downing Street in London. But my mother's father was Milton Jones, and he was quite a colorful man. I do remember him. He died when I was 5. He was retired from the Navy. Oh, no, actually, he served on Navy ships, but he was in the Marine Corps. And there was some talk about his being on the Maine, but I have never found any proof of that. And as someone once told me, false genealogy is worse than none at all. So if you can find proof that he was on the Maine, you're better than I am. I grew up before school going back and forth from Virginia to New York. And my father, I realize now what he was trying to do. He really wanted to live in the South, but the work was in the North. And but he finally put his foot down in about 1937. I was about to start school in Norview, and he wanted to move back. So we did. He bought a little piece of land, and he bought a book on how to build a house. And he had a lot of skills that he had learned from training as a blacksmith under his father, and he built us a house. And I want to tell you, he worked in the shipyard during the day, and he built a house at night, and which was very difficult. And when I was 6 years old, we were living in half. He had put down the whole foundation of the house, but only framed up part of it. And then we moved in that part and lived there. And you could see through the rooms, just the, walk through the studs. My mother was so fussy. She had manufactured Oriental carpets on the wood floor, the basic wood floor. And she gave me this party, invited all the children in the neighborhood. I didn't get another birthday party till I was 12. And then she only invited girls because she said the boys swung from the rafters, and they really did. They were just terrible. But 1938, I started school. And I remember, I'm only bringing this up now because we're having this terrible war in the Ukraine. And I remember how upset my parents were when Hitler invaded Poland. So this is all history repeating itself for me, and it's very upsetting. And one day in December the 7th, 1941, I went to church, and while I was still in my frilly dress and white Mary Janes, I went to a birthday party of a friend. Her name was Marlene Mead, and people were talking about this attack. Well, I wasn't paying any attention because I was having a good time. When we came home, my best friend Joyce and my father sat us down in the living room and explained what happened, and he said, "This means we're at war." Well, I had gone to the movies with my mother. In those days, the only visual proof you had of news, was the newsreels. And I remember seeing Japanese soldiers going into Nanking. I've never seen these newsreels since, but the soldiers would pull the babies out of the mother's arms and throw them up in the air and use them for bayonet practice. Of course, raping the women, they didn't show us that, but I thought that's what they were going to come over and do to me. And I started to cry. Well, my daddy couldn't stand to see me cry, and he said, "Oh, don't cry. We'll go to Granby Street and have Chinese food." So we did, and when we got to Granby Street, usually on Sunday night, it was just a sea of sailors. There was none. There was a police car, a patrol car, or a Navy car in front of every Chinese restaurant. They were arresting everybody that was Oriental. And I remember these Chinese chefs coming out. He said, me not Chinese, I'm Japanese, me Chinese. And they didn't care. They threw them in the wagon anyway. But that was the beginning of World War II. And it was a defining time in my life. And I'll probably talk quite a bit about it because I'm still reliving. And Norfolk grew, and it just exploded with sailors, and people were fixing up their garages and renting them out so dependents could come and bring their wives. And anyway, it was exciting, but it was also so scary. And because the first few months of the war, until the Battle of Midway, we were not winning. We were losing this war. And all I could think about is these Japanese soldiers and their bayonets. Well, anyway, we got through the war, but sort of at the end, my father was building houses, and the government in 1943, I think, stopped all building for civilian. Everything had to be military. So basically, he was out of business. And I don't know why, but he joined the Merchant Marines. He had worked on a tugboat for his cousin in the Norfolk Harbor, wood tugging. But that's all the sea duty that I knew of that he had. But he was a patriot, and he wanted to do his share. Even though he was in his early 40s, he was beyond the draft, and he had a dependent. He went anyway, and I've always been very proud of that. So we moved back to New York for a time to be near him. And that was an interesting experience because I went 1 year to a school, public school in New York. It was called PS 126. They give them numbers rather than names.
Sorry.
Anyway, it was an extremely good school, the strictest teachers I've ever had, but I learned a lot. And my mother got a little job in New York, in the city. We were living in Astoria, and we used to go back and forth and go to the movies. And on Saturdays, she'd take me to the Taft Tea Room for lunch, and they had a full orchestra. And I don't know, life was, and of course, maybe every sixth man was a civilian. Everybody was in uniform, if you can visualize that. And at the end of the war, of course, Daddy left the Merchant Marines, and we moved back to Norfolk. And I went to high school in Norview for a year. And what was happening, the shipyards were closing down. Norfolk went, and the Tidewater area went to just everybody needing employees, to everybody laying off. So my parents were very adventuresome. They had heard Seattle was an exciting place to live in. So we moved to Seattle, and the first day of my freshman year at Roosevelt High School, I'll never forget that day. I was standing in the hall. I didn't know anybody, but I was just riveted on all of these young men who had either been drafted or enlisted out of their senior years, who had gone through 4 years of war and now were back to finish their senior year so they could go to the University of Washington on the GI Bill. I saw fighter pilots walking down the halls in their leather jackets with the stripes on the arms of how many Japanese or German planes they had shot down. They were the handsomest men I have ever seen in my life. They were tall, they were slim, and the girls were falling all over them.
I believe that.
Oh, yes. And my 4 years in high school was nice, and it was uneventful. It was an extremely good school. It was named Roosevelt after Teddy Roosevelt, and by the time we graduated, we knew everything about Teddy Roosevelt that there was almost everything to know. And we had a whole semester of Shakespeare. How many schools for an English semester give you a semester of Shakespeare? We had a semester of public speaking. These things have gone so far to help me because I did not go to college. My father thought it was a waste of money to send a girl to college. But I think Roosevelt went a long way to kind of giving me what was today may have been an associate degree. And during my 4 years, I dated a young boy named Robert Cochran. He was 2 years ahead of me. He, of course, got out and went on to the University of Washington. And when I was a senior ready to graduate, my mother and father decided to move back to Seattle. Well, I was so entrenched there. I had so many friends at this time. I was president of my high school sorority, and I didn't want to leave. Well, I'm going to be very honest with you, grandchildren. Bob came over and he said, well, why don't we get married? Now, I was 18. And at first I said no. And then I thought, and he kept asking, I kept thinking, well, if I marry Bob, I can stay in Seattle. So I said yes, for the dumbest reasons. He was a perfectly nice young man with wonderful parents. Anyway, I won't go into the details, but we got married, and we wound up moving back to Virginia because the Korean War was going on. I mean, war is a part of my life. The Korean War was going on, and he was about to be drafted. So I got a job a nice job as a medical secretary, and he went off and joined the Army. Of course, it was the government's idea. He was drafted. And while he was gone, I made a decision that I had to get a divorce. I knew that I didn't love this young man. I had been in this marriage 3 years, and I knew that I didn't have any children. If I didn't get out of this now, I would be stuck for the rest of my life. Well, my mother especially just adored Bob. And my father, and I mean, in 1953, nobody in my family had gotten a divorce. There wasn't such a thing as no-fault divorce. I hope you look up what that means. And there were some states that just didn't have a divorce law. You had to go to South America, Nevada, or someplace like that. So it's a long story, but finally I got on a train one Sunday afternoon and went to Nevada. I went to Washington, changed planes, went to Chicago, changed trains, and then went to this little town in Elko, Nevada that my mother and father and I had stayed in once overnight when we were driving across country. And I got a place to live. I got a lawyer. And I started the proceedings, which was not a nice thing to do. You just didn't divorce servicemen, especially when they were overseas. And I wouldn't have done it, but his ship was on the way to Korea when they now announced the war was over. So I felt that I was free to live my life. So I stayed the 6 weeks, and it was quite an experience. The people were really quite nice. It was a very different way of living. There were a lot of rich cattlemen there, and anyway, it was, and I made friends, and when it was over, I got my divorce, and I came back to Richmond. My parents, surprisingly, met me at the train station. I thought I was disowned, but they didn't, and my dad said to me that night, "Well, what are you going to do now?" I said, "Well, I'm thinking about going back to Norfolk and getting a job." He said, "That's a great idea. We will take you tomorrow, and you can stay at Cousin Libby's." Cousin Libby had an boarding house in Ghent, and she was in her 90s then, and she had had a boarding house since my parents spent their wedding night at her boarding house, so that tells you how long. And she was quite a character. So we went to Cousin Libby's, and I got a room there. And of course, Daddy realized that she would keep an eye on me, and I'm sure that was his motive. But I got a job working for a doctor, and I just had a nice time. I met all kinds of young men I dated, and then I met my husband, Bill, who was, at that time, he was enlisted. He was a third class, and he told me he was getting ready to take the exam for chief, which he did, and he was rated third in the Navy in math. He was very smart, and so he made chief, and then he came home, and we dated, and the cruises on a carrier, he was on the Randolph, are 7 months. So we did most of our dating through letters. And that, I don't think, is a bad thing, because you can get a lot of things settled by mail. And if you're person to person, you're just too fast, I think. Anyway, he came home again, he proposed, and I was very careful. I thought I had had a divorce, and I didn't want to make another mistake. And I said, "I will take your ring on the condition that when you get back from this next cruise, if I've changed my mind, I'll give it to you." So he agreed, and he went away again for 7 months. We wrote letters and then came back, and he came back June the 16th, and we got married July the 16th in the Navy Chapel in Norfolk. And we were very happy, and I got pregnant with Mark, and he got orders to go to Bath, Maine, to the Bath shipyard and aboard a new destroyer that was being built, the Barry. And so we went up, and I was very close to having Mark. And I came into labor in the afternoon of in August 14th, and I called him from to the ship, and they couldn't find Bill, and the captain sent 3 sailors, to take me to the hospital. Anyway, it's a funny story. They took me to a clinic because I didn't want to go without my husband, and I told them they could go back to the ship and I would be fine. And he said, "No, ma'am, we can't do that. The captain's ordered us to stay here with you." Well, in the meantime, they had found Bill, and he took me to the hospital, and Mark was born in the wee hours of the next morning. And we spent quite a while in Boston, which was nice, and we made wonderful friends. And then went to, he got shore duty in Pensacola, Florida. That is something I never really particularly enjoyed, the heat, and just the difference from the black shoe to the brown shoe Navy. And I'm not going to go into details, but I became pregnant with Matthew, and he was born there. So I like to think I was busy having babies and taking care of them. So leaving Pensacola was a happy day in my life. And then he got orders to the Blandy in Newport, Rhode Island. That was wonderful. There was nothing not to like about Newport. It was just wonderful. I was a new officer's wife. My husband had just gotten his commission. And he had been recommended when he was in Boston, and he's on the Berry. No, well, anyway, I've forgotten where. But the Captain Kelly, I'm sorry, I'm losing it here. Captain Isaac Kidd recommended him for his commission. And I mention this because Captain Isaac Kidd's father was Admiral Isaac Kidd, and he was killed on the Arizona on Pearl Harbor. He was a first-line officer to die in World War II. And the interesting thing, of course, they never found his body. And recently, some Navy divers went down, and there were areas that they allowed them to go into because that's a tomb. It's sacred ground. And they found his Naval Academy class ring riveted to the brass railing on the bridge. So apparently when that big bomb hit, he grabbed that for support, and that was the end of him. But Newport was, Bill had 3 tours of duty there. He was on the Blandy. And as I said, I still have friends, Navy wives, that I still correspond with. And I'm doing a program right now about the Cuban Missile Crisis. And it all goes back to the Blandy. He left there, and he was assigned to teach at OCS for 3 years. He taught an accelerated class of LDOs, which is young men that are coming up through the ranks, and they don't need a lot of the knife and fork stuff. And then from there, he went to a destroyer repair ship, the Yosemite, and then he retired. And that's when things got kind of difficult for me. He got a job. He was offered a job with Sanders Associates in Nashua, New Hampshire. Yankee land and steroids. Anyway, and he was offered a job with Alice Chalmers in Atlanta, where you can imagine the one I wanted him to take, but he didn't discuss it with me. He took the one in New Hampshire. So we moved to New Hampshire, and we were there for 23 years. The boys went to school. They were in grade school when Bill retired. They graduated from high school. They went to colleges in Boston. They got, I think, very good educations. Matthew graduated from Northeastern, and Mark graduated Wentworth Institute. And then he went to Rochester Institute in New York State, which was a good school. So I just never felt that I belonged in New Hampshire. The neighbors they were good people, but they just, didn't let you in. And but the boys got their education up there, and that was the most important thing to me. And then Mark was a engineering co-op student, and on one of his co-op periods to Raytheon, he met Shelley, and they fell in love, and they got married, and they had 2 little boys, Kyle and Tyler, who are very, very precious to me. It was a troubled marriage. Shelley had a lot of problems, and quite frankly, Mark just didn't know how to deal with them. So he wound up just walking away, which I understood at the time, but the toll on the children was just not good. And they got a divorce, and he was single for, I think, about 6 years. In the meantime, Matt graduated, and he met the love of his life, Carolyn. She was from a wonderful home. Her father was a Harvard professor, and she was madly in love with Matthew. And all she wanted was to be his wife and to have his baby. Mm-hmm. And she got pregnant, and then she got cancer. And when she was 5 months pregnant, she was finally diagnosed with cancer. Mm-hmm. And they tried not to treat the cancer to save the baby at first, but the cancer was feeding on the hormones of the pregnancy. So at 7 months, they had to do an abortion, one of those late abortions, and then she died anyway. And that was, I think, one of the biggest tragedies of my life, to see your son in that much pain and you can't do anything. It was terrible. I'm sorry. Then Matthew met, I think it was, he and Marcy married. There's been a lot of sadness in Matthew's life. He met Marcy. She was a lawyer. She was so cute and had this personality, and they were really happy. And they got married, and they were married, I think, 13 years, and she got a disease called scleroderma, and she passed away just after I moved here to Westminster. And meantime, Mark had remarried Mary Ellen, and they had, boom, 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 3 little girls in 4 years. There are 2 of them are in college now.
Knock them out quickly.
I'm really, and the girls are doing well. They've been parented, I think, well, and I'm really pleased about that. And then a few years ago, Matthew married again for the 3rd time. He has this phenomenal talent for picking wonderful girls, and this girl's name is Kathy, and they seem happy. She's a teacher, and she's getting ready to retire, and they're building a house on the Cape. So I wish them a long and healthy life together. Then about this time, Bill was getting ready to retire and moved to just getting ready to retire, and we decided that he was from Baltimore and I was from Norfolk, that we wanted to move south. And we managed to move to a wonderful town in North Carolina, Edenton, and we were there I was there for 23 years. It was one of the happiest times of my life. I was active in the DAR, and we lived backed up to a golf course, and Bill got up 5 mornings a week and went and played golf. It was like a job. And we, in fact, I still go back and see friends often. And my friends are there. I told everyone I don't want a 90th birthday party, but they're giving me one anyway. Oh. But about 2007, we when at Christmas time we took a river cruise in Germany down the Rhine River and the Main and the Rhine from Nuremberg to Amsterdam. And Bill had this spot on his lungs that they had been watching for years, and all of a sudden it changed, and he didn't want the biopsy. And so on the way home, I was on that trip, I realized that something was very wrong. And on the flight home, he told me that he was going to have the biopsy. And he did, and it was malignant. And he had lung cancer, but it was contributed to by the asbestos that he was exposed to in the Navy. And I did file for a claim, and it was honored. So I get a little check each month from the VA. And anyway, he didn't last long. He was diagnosed in February, and he died in June. And I don't know what to say except that it was a sad time, and for me and for my children and for the dog. The dog had a terrible time. His name was Turbo. He was a Jack Russell, and his name suited him. And he stood at the front door for days looking for Bill. And the neighbors brought him treats. They did everything. But then he got mad at me. I think he thought I had done something to make Bill go. And so that's kind of... and I stayed 2 or 3 years, and I've always been someone that looks ahead. And I thought, when I get so I can't take care of myself, I don't have anybody here except my friends, and to take care of me. And I was in a house, and so I knew about Westminster. We used to go to the fish house and eat next door. And I called and asked for a brochure, and they sent it, and I came and I looked. It took about 4 years because Bill died in 2008 as the economy went bad, and nothing in the real estate in North Carolina was selling then. But one day a cash buyer came in, and everything moved really fast. And I moved to Westminster. It was the best thing I've ever done for myself. And I've made lots of friends. And I'm very grateful. It's a wonderful place, a wonderful idea program, the way they do things I approve of. And I think that's about it, except, I'm be 90 in just a few days. What's the date of today?
In like 2 weeks, I think you said.
Yes.
26?
2 weeks, 26. And I can't believe that I've lived 90 years, and I've lived through everything I've talked about. And it's been a good life. I've had sadness, and I just want to say, my husband and I, he was the love of my life, and I think he told me I'd been the love of his, but that doesn't mean our marriage was perfect. And I don't want my grandchildren to think if you fall in love and you get married, everything's going to be perfect. It's not. We had to deal with a tremendous amount of interference from my husband's mother, and that's all I'm going to say about that.
Oh, the sweet in-laws.
Yeah, well, she meant well, but it didn't turn out that way. But I feel fortunate to have lived 90 years, and I think I've learned a few things, and some of them too late, but I want you all, my grandchildren, I wish you a good life. And the only advice I can give you is to be honest with yourself and your friends and anybody in your relationship. I think dishonesty is one of the worst things that you can participate in. It will destroy you. Mm-hmm. So I want to say goodbye.
Okay.
And I want to tell you that please don't cry, even though I am. I love you all. Bye-bye.
Dorothy, we appreciate you sharing your story with us, and we really hope that your grandchildren get to listen to this and hear who their grandmother was and the story of her life. And so we really appreciate your time and you joining us today, and keep listening to the Westminster Canterbury Tales. Thank you so much. We hope you enjoyed this episode of the Westminster Canterbury Tales podcast. Thank you for listening.